I am broken. My beautiful life has gone downhill, my wife is cheating with people I've known for years. It's a story that is hard for me to tell, it touched me to the core. It was the kind of evening that felt deceptively normal. The soft hum of the dishwasher filled the kitchen as I leaned against the counter, nursing a glass of bourbon. My wife, Caroline, had just left for her book club, the same Wednesday routine she'd maintained for years. Our teenage daughters, Claire and Megan, were upstairs, their laughter occasionally drifting down like a comforting reminder that family life was intact, until it wasn't. The first crack appeared when Megan called me over to help with her math homework. She handed me her phone to show the assignment in the school app, and I noticed a text notification from a name I didn't recognize, Dominic. The preview read, "Can't wait to see you again this weekend." "Who's Dominic?" I asked casually, my tone steady despite the chill creeping into my chest. Megan shrugged. "Probably Mom's coworker. She talks about him a lot." I nodded, but something in my gut twisted. Caroline had never mentioned a Dominic. She worked in real estate, a world filled with business dinners and late-night emails, but I trusted her implicitly, or at least I had. That night, I lay awake as Caroline slid into bed, her perfume faint but distinct. My mind raced, dissecting every late meeting, every unexplained phone call. I told myself I was overreacting, that suspicion could erode even the strongest marriage. We had been together for 20 years, raised 2 incredible daughters, and weathered life's storms side by side. This was just a fleeting paranoia. But the doubts wouldn't let go. The next day, while Caroline was out, I decided to confirm my instincts, or put them to rest. I combed through our shared calendar and her recent emails, finding nothing unusual. It wasn't until I opened her tablet and scrolled through her messages that I found it. Dominic was not just a coworker. The messages were explicit, dripping with intimacy and promises that shattered the image of our life together. The worst part? Dominic wasn't the only one. There were messages from 2 other men, Carl and Andrew. Each man had his own thread, his own role in Caroline's double life. My breath hitched as I stared at the screen. 3 years. She'd been doing this for 3 years. Each message told a story of stolen weekends, hurried rendezvous, and a woman I didn't recognize. The wife I thought I knew was a stranger with a secret life spanning years and men. My hands shook as I closed the app. The bourbon from last night churned in my stomach, threatening to rise. 20 years of trust, love, and shared history had been gutted in the span of 10 minutes. Upstairs, the sound of Claire's guitar drifted through the house, a reminder of the life I'd thought was solid. For a moment, I wanted to storm into Caroline's office and confront her immediately. But I knew better. This wasn't a moment for impulsiveness. I needed to understand the full scope of her betrayal before deciding what to do next. As I sat in the living room, replaying every moment of our marriage with new eyes, one thought crystallized in my mind: the life we built was a lie, but I wasn't going to crumble under its weight. This wasn't just about her deceit, it was about how I would reclaim my life, my dignity, and my family's future. The storm was coming, but I wasn't going to face it unprepared. The days that followed were a blur of routine and surveillance. I became a man on autopilot, showing up for work, helping the girls with school projects, and eating dinner at the same table as Caroline, while the storm inside me grew. Her betrayals weren't isolated moments of weakness. They were carefully managed affairs, layered with lies and buried under years of routine. I needed more than the messages on her tablet. I needed to know exactly who these men were, what they meant to her, and how deep the deception ran. I started small. "Book club again?" I asked casually one evening, watching her lace her boots by the door. She glanced up with a distracted smile. "Yeah, I'm running late." I walked over, kissed her cheek, and handed her a thermos of coffee. "Drive safe." "Love you." She froze for a fraction of a second, just long enough for me to notice. "Love you too," she said softly before heading out. As soon as the door shut, I grabbed my jacket and keys. Her book club met at a local cafe downtown, but she drove right past it. I trailed her from a distance, my grip tightening on the wheel with every turn she made. She parked in front of a small, upscale hotel. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched her step out, adjusting her coat before walking through the entrance. A minute later, a tall man with dark hair followed her inside. Dominic. I sat in the car for what felt like hours, rage simmering beneath my skin. She didn't leave until after midnight. When she finally emerged, Dominic walked her to her car, kissed her goodbye, and drove off in a separate vehicle. The next morning, I took the girls to school as usual. Claire chattered about her upcoming recital while Megan complained about a history test. I listened, nodded, and smiled, but my mind was elsewhere. As soon as they were safely inside, I made a call. "Hello," a deep voice answered. "Is this Dominic Hart?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "Yeah. Who's this?" There was a pause as he waited for me to introduce myself. I let the silence stretch before finally speaking. "I'm Caroline's husband." The line went dead for a moment before he cleared his throat. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't insult me. I've seen the messages, Dominic. I followed her last night." There was a long silence before he sighed heavily. "Look, man, I didn't know she was married. She told me she was divorced." "Divorced?" I laughed bitterly. "Did she also tell you she has 2 kids?" "She mentioned them, but I assumed they were with her ex." Anger flared, but I kept my voice calm. "How long has this been going on?" "Almost 2 years." I clenched my fist so tightly that my knuckles ached. "And the others?" "Carl and Andrew. Do you know them?" "No. I swear I don't." I hung up before he could say anything else. I didn't want his apologies. I didn't want his excuses. I wanted the truth, and I was going to get it. That evening, I confronted Caroline. Not directly, but subtly. As we sat down for dinner, I slid her phone across the table. "Forgot this in the living room," I said. Her eyes darted to the phone, her expression carefully neutral. "Thanks." I leaned back in my chair, watching her closely. "You've been really busy lately. How's the book club?" She looked up, startled. "What? You've been going out a lot. Must be an interesting book." She forced a laugh. "Yeah, it's a good group." For a moment, we just stared at each other. The tension in the room was palpable, but Claire and Megan were oblivious, engrossed in their meal. I knew she was lying, and now she knew I was watching. Later that night, after the girls had gone to bed, Caroline approached me in the living room. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice hesitant. I looked at her for a long time, taking in the woman I thought I knew. Her blonde hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, and her eyes, once so familiar, seemed distant now. "Yeah," I finally said. "Everything's fine." She sat down beside me, curling her legs under her. "You've seemed off lately." I turned to her, my expression unreadable. "Maybe I've just been seeing things more clearly." She flinched slightly but recovered quickly. "We should plan a weekend getaway. Just the 2 of us. We haven't done that in a while." My stomach twisted at the suggestion. A getaway? After everything she'd done? "Maybe," I said, standing up. "I'll think about it." As I walked up the stairs, her voice followed me. "Liam. I love you." I paused, my hand resting on the banister. "Good night, Caroline." The cracks in our foundation were widening, but she still didn't realize the whole structure was about to collapse. The next morning, Caroline was unusually affectionate. She lingered at my side as I made coffee, kissed my cheek more than once, and asked if I wanted to go out for dinner that night. It felt staged, like she knew something was off but couldn't quite figure out how much I knew. I played along. "Sure," I said. "Let's go to that Italian place you love." Her face brightened. "Really? We haven't been there in ages." I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. That's what you wanted, right? Time together. The weight of her betrayal sat heavily in my chest, but I wasn't ready to confront her yet. I needed to know more. Who were these men to her? And why had she thrown away everything we'd built? That afternoon, I reached out to a private investigator. His name was Sam Walker, a no-nonsense guy with a reputation for getting answers without leaving a trail. I need to know everything, I told him. Who they are, how they met my wife, and how long it's been going on. Sam nodded, jotting down notes. I'll handle it. Give me a few days. In the meantime, I kept playing my role as the devoted husband. That evening, we went out to dinner. Caroline dressed up, wearing the black dress I loved. She looked beautiful, radiant even. But as I watched her across the candlelit table, I couldn't help but wonder, how many times had she worn that dress for someone else? So, she said, swirling her wine. What's been on your mind lately? You've been quiet. I shrugged. Work's been busy. Her eyes searched mine, and for a moment, I thought I saw guilt flicker across her face. But just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by the same practiced smile she'd worn for years. How's Dominic? I asked suddenly, my tone casual. Her hand froze mid-air, the wineglass trembling slightly. What? I saw an email from him on your tablet, I lied smoothly. Seemed friendly. She recovered quickly, setting her glass down with a laugh that sounded forced. Oh, that. He's just a client. I was helping him find a place. I leaned back in my chair, studying her. Seems like you've been helping a lot of people lately. Her smile faltered. Liam. What are you saying? I shook my head, forcing a chuckle. Nothing. Just an observation. The rest of dinner passed in tense silence. When we got home, Caroline went straight to the shower, and I waited until I heard the water running before I checked her phone again. This time, there were no messages from Dominic, Carl, or Andrew. She'd either deleted them or switched to another device. But I wasn't done. I remembered something Sam had told me when we met earlier. Affairs are never just about lust. They're about control, secrecy, and fantasy. People like Caroline, they need that rush. The question isn't why she started. It's why she couldn't stop. As I sat in the quiet living room, I realized that was the question burning in my mind. It wasn't just one man. It was three. What was she getting from them that she couldn't get from me? The next day, Sam called. His voice was clipped, professional. I've got some initial findings. Go on. There's a pattern here, he said. Your wife's been seeing Dominic for 2 years, Carl for a little over a year, and Andrew for about 6 months. She keeps them separate. None of them know about the others. I pinched the bridge of my nose, fighting the wave of nausea rising in my stomach. And how did she meet them? Dominic was a client. Carl is a neighbor, lives a few streets over. And Andrew, Sam paused. Andrew's the father of one of your daughter's friends. I felt the blood drain from my face. Are you sure? Positive. My mind raced. I pictured Andrew at school events, standing next to his wife, chatting with the other parents. Had he smiled at me? Shaken my hand? She's bold, Sam continued. The level of risk she's taken, it's not typical. Most people keep affairs discreet. Your wife. She's juggling multiple lives. I hung up, my hand shaking as I gripped the phone. Upstairs, Caroline was helping Megan with a school project, her laughter ringing out like everything was normal. But it wasn't. Nothing about our life was normal anymore. And I was done being the fool. It was time to start tearing down the lies. I spent the next 2 days in a fog of quiet rage. Every glance, every word from Caroline felt like a performance, and I couldn't tell if she was oblivious to my growing anger, or if she thought her mask was still holding. Sam's investigation continued. He sent me photos, Caroline with Dominic outside the hotel, Caroline with Carl laughing at a coffee shop, and the one that hit me hardest, Caroline standing too close to Andrew at a soccer game, their fingers brushing when they thought no one was watching. I studied that photo for a long time. Andrew. A father. A family man. Just like me. Had he been standing next to me on the sidelines while I cheered for Megan, smiling at me like everything was normal? The betrayal stung more sharply with him than the others. He wasn't a faceless stranger. He was part of our world. I knew I couldn't keep this bottled up much longer. The rage was a ticking time bomb, and I needed to confront Caroline before it consumed me completely. That evening, after dinner, I asked the girls to head upstairs. "Claire, Megan, early night for you too. Your mom and I need to talk." They both groaned but obeyed, trudging up the stairs with exaggerated sighs. Once their doors closed, I turned to Caroline. She stood by the sink, drying a wineglass, her expression wary. "What's this about?" she asked. I walked toward her slowly, my hands in my pockets, keeping my tone calm despite the storm inside me. "I want to talk about honesty." Her brow furrowed, confusion flickering across her face. "What do you mean?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out a printed photo, her and Dominic outside the hotel. I slid it across the counter toward her. Her face went pale. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "You tell me." She stared at the photo, her hands trembling. For a moment, I thought she might try to deny it. But then her shoulders slumped, and the glass in her hand slipped, shattering on the floor. "Liam." Her voice broke, and tears welled in her eyes. "It's not what it looks like." I barked out a bitter laugh. "It's exactly what it looks like. And it's not just him, is it? There's Carl. There's Andrew." I leaned in, my voice dropping to a deadly calm. "Did you think I wouldn't find out?" She collapsed onto the stool at the kitchen island, covering her face with her hands. "I never meant to hurt you." "Spare me the clichés," I snapped. "You didn't mean to hurt me. Caroline, you've been doing this for years. With multiple men. You've lied to me, to our kids, to everyone. This wasn't a mistake. This was a choice, a series of choices." Her sobs grew louder, echoing through the kitchen. But I wasn't done. "Tell me why," I demanded. "Why did you do it? Were we not enough for you? Was I not enough?" She shook her head violently. "No, that's not it. I love you, Liam. I do." Love? The word felt like poison on my tongue. "Is that what you call it? Because where I come from, love doesn't look like this." "I was lonely," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You were always busy. You stopped noticing me." I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to yell. "So this is my fault?" "No," she cried. "It's not about blame. I was lost. I got caught up in something I couldn't stop." I stared at her, disgust and disbelief warring inside me. "You couldn't stop. You've been playing house with other men while coming home to me and our daughters, and you're telling me you couldn't stop." She buried her face in her hands again, her shoulders shaking with sobs. For a moment, I just stood there, the weight of it all pressing down on me. Then I leaned in, my voice cold and steady. "I'm not the same man I was a week ago, Caroline. You've broken something in me. But don't think for a second that I'm going to let you keep controlling the narrative." She looked up, her tear-streaked face full of despair. What are you going to do?" I held her gaze, unflinching. "I'm going to make sure everyone sees the truth." With that, I turned and walked out of the room, her sobs following me down the hall. The next morning, I dropped Megan off at school as usual. As I sat in the car, watching her walk inside, I noticed Andrew across the lot, chatting with another parent. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. He had no idea what was coming. I wasn't going to confront him in a parking lot. No, this had to be done right. I took out my phone and sent a message to Sam. "Find out where Andrew will be tomorrow morning. I want to talk to him." Sam responded within minutes. Already done. He has coffee every morning at Grove Street Cafe. Alone. Perfect. Tomorrow morning, Andrew and I would have a little chat. The first domino had fallen, and the rest were about to follow. The next morning, I woke before dawn, the weight of what I was about to do pressing heavily on my chest. The man staring back at me in the bathroom mirror was different, hardened by betrayal, steadier in his resolve. The indecision that had gripped me days ago was gone. I knew exactly what needed to be done, and I was ready to face it head-on. The Grove Street Cafe was quiet when I arrived. The scent of fresh coffee hung in the air, and soft jazz played from overhead speakers. I scanned the room until I spotted him, Andrew, sitting at a corner table by the window, sipping his coffee and scrolling through his phone. I took a moment to steady myself before walking over. "Mind if I join you?" Andrew looked up, surprised. His confusion quickly shifted to a polite smile. "Liam." "Hey, of course. Sit down." I pulled out the chair across from him, keeping my movements slow and deliberate. For a moment, we sat in silence. I let him squirm a little, watching as he fidgeted with his cup. "How's Megan?" he asked, attempting to break the tension. "She's good," I said flatly. "How's your daughter?" "Ella's doing great." He took a nervous sip of his coffee. "She's been practicing for the recital. I think Megan's in it too, right?" I nodded, leaning forward slightly. "Yeah. They've been friends for a long time. Our families have known each other for years." Andrew smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He could sense something was off. "So," he said carefully. "What's this about, Liam?" I pulled a photo from my jacket pocket, the one Sam had given me of Andrew and Caroline, their bodies angled toward each other, too close to be innocent. I slid it across the table. Andrew's face drained of color. His hand trembled as he reached for the photo. "I think you know what it's about," I said quietly. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "Liam, Don't." I held up a hand to stop him. "Don't insult me with excuses. I've had enough of those from her." Andrew's eyes darted to the cafe's entrance, as if calculating an escape route. But I wasn't letting him off that easily. "How long?" I asked, my voice cold and steady. He looked down at the table, shame written all over his face. 6 months. 6 months, I repeated, bitterness coating the words. "You've been sleeping with my wife for half a year, all while smiling at me during school events, shaking my hand, chatting about soccer games. Were you ever going to tell me?" Andrew ran a hand through his hair, looking like a man on the verge of collapse. "No. I never wanted it to get this far. I didn't plan any of this." "You didn't plan it?" I leaned in, my voice low but full of fury. "What exactly did you think was going to happen, Andrew? That you could play house with my wife and everything would be fine? That I wouldn't find out?" He shook his head, his eyes glistening with tears. "I was a fool. She made me feel special. I cut in. Important. Seen." He nodded slowly, his shame deepening. "She told you she was lonely, didn't she? That I was distant. That our marriage was cold." Andrew's silence was all the confirmation I needed. "That's her script," I said bitterly. "She used it on Dominic. On Carl. And on you." Andrew's head snapped up, his eyes widening. "There are others?" "Oh, yes," I said, a humorless laugh escaping me. "You weren't the only one. Not by a long shot." He leaned back in his chair, looking like he might be sick. I had no idea." "Of course you didn't. She's good at this." I sat back, crossing my arms. "She's been juggling 3 of you. Maybe more. Who knows?" Andrew buried his face in his hands, groaning in frustration. "God. My wife." "Yeah," I said quietly. "Ella's mom. She deserves to know." Andrew looked up sharply. "No. Please. Don't tell her. She's going to find out eventually, I said, shrugging. Whether it's from me or someone else. The truth has a way of coming out. Liam, I'll end it. I swear. I'll never speak to Caroline again. Just, don't destroy my family. His desperation was pathetic, but it didn't move me. You think your family isn't already destroyed? Andrew flinched as if I'd struck him. I stood, sliding the photo back into my pocket. You need to tell your wife, Andrew. Because if you don't, I will. With that, I walked out of the cafe, leaving him staring after me, broken and defeated. When I got back home, Caroline was in the kitchen, pretending to bake cookies with Megan. She looked up as I entered, her expression wary. Where have you been? Out. Our eyes locked, and in that moment, she knew something had shifted. Andrew was the first domino. The rest would fall soon enough. The day after confronting Andrew, I decided it was time to knock down the next piece. Dominic was next. Unlike Andrew, who had cowered under guilt, Dominic was a wild card, a man with nothing to lose and no family to protect. I tracked him to a trendy bar downtown, a place he frequented after work. Sam had given me the details. Dominic was a smooth-talking real estate agent, charming enough to win clients and dangerous enough to use that charm recklessly. I walked in just as he was ordering a drink, his shirt collar loosened and his sleeves rolled up. He oozed confidence, oblivious to the wreckage he'd helped create. I slid onto the stool next to him. Dominic. He glanced over, and for a second, confusion clouded his face. Then recognition hit. Liam. His voice faltered slightly. Wow. Didn't expect to see you here. I imagine you didn't. He shifted in his seat, glancing around nervously. What brings you out tonight? I leaned in, my voice low and steady. You. He swallowed hard, trying to mask his discomfort with a grin. Listen, man, if this is about Caroline. It's exactly about Caroline. My tone stayed calm, but the weight behind it was undeniable. And you're going to tell me everything. Dominic exhaled slowly, setting his drink down. Look, I didn't know she was married at first. She told me you two were separated. Did she? I smiled coldly. And when you found out she wasn't? Did that stop you? He rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding my gaze. No. It didn't. At least you're honest, I said, though my words dripped with sarcasm. Unlike her. He glanced around again, clearly uncomfortable. Why are you here, Liam? What do you want? I want to understand. I straightened in my seat, my voice sharpening. How long did you think you could keep sneaking around with my wife? Did you ever stop to think about what would happen if I found out? Dominic met my gaze then, his demeanor shifting from nervous to defensive. I'm not the only one to blame here. Caroline came to me. She wanted this. I clenched my fists, keeping my rage in check. Don't try to shift the blame. You knew she was married, and you chose to keep going. Dominic shrugged, leaning back against the bar. She made it pretty clear things weren't great at home. Said you were distant. Said she felt invisible. Invisible. That word again. Caroline's script, perfectly rehearsed and deployed with precision. I stood, towering over him. Well, Dominic, let me make one thing clear. You've had your fun. But it ends now. And if it doesn't, he asked, smirking despite himself. My expression hardened. Then you'll regret it. There was no mistaking the threat in my voice, and Dominic's smirk faded. I get it, he said quietly. It's over. I leaned in one last time, my words cold and final. You're damn right it is. When I got home, Caroline was waiting for me. She sat on the couch, her knees pulled up to her chest, her eyes red from crying. Where were you? She asked, her voice trembling. Out, I said, hanging up my coat. Out where? She stood, wrapping her arms around herself like she was shielding against an invisible storm. I met her gaze, unflinching. I saw Dominic. Her face paled, and she staggered back like I'd struck her. You did. I did. And he told me everything. Her hands trembled as she pressed them to her mouth. Liam, please. Please what? My voice was sharp, cutting through her tears. Please understand. Please forgive. Tell me, Caroline, how many times did you sit across from me at dinner, smiling, knowing you were sneaking around behind my back? She sobbed, shaking her head. I never wanted to hurt you. But you did. My words were steady, each one a nail in the coffin of our marriage. Over and over again. With Dominic. With Andrew. With Carl. And God knows who else. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the couch. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. I stood over her, unmoved. You're sorry you got caught. Not sorry for what you did. Her sobs filled the room, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. The woman I had loved for 20 years was gone, replaced by someone I no longer recognized. I don't know if we can come back from this, Caroline, I said quietly. And right now, I don't even know if I want to. She looked up, her tear-streaked face full of desperation. Liam, please. We can fix this. I shook my head. You don't fix this. You survive it. As I walked out of the room, her cries echoed behind me. 2 dominoes down. 1 more to go. And this time, I wasn't waiting for the truth to come to me. I was going to drag it into the light. I sat in my car outside Carl's house, watching the glow of the porch light flicker against the dark sky. It was almost poetic, everything on the surface seemed warm and inviting, but underneath, there was rot. Just like my marriage. Carl wasn't just another stranger. He lived 2 streets over. Our daughters had played together when they were younger. We'd stood side by side at neighborhood barbecues, shared beers, and talked about work, family, life. All the while, he was making moves on my wife. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. There was no turning back. Carl opened the door, his expression shifting from confusion to concern when he saw me. Liam. Hey. Everything okay? No, I said flatly. Not at all. I pushed past him into the house, uninvited. He didn't stop me. Maybe he knew. Maybe he'd been waiting for this. Listen, man, if this is about. It is, I interrupted, turning to face him. It's about Caroline. And you. He froze. The words hung between us, heavy and inescapable. I don't know what to say, he finally muttered. You don't need to say anything. I'm here to do the talking. I stepped closer, keeping my voice calm but unyielding. You've been in my house. You've met my kids. All the while, you've been sleeping with my wife. He looked away, guilt written all over his face. I never meant for it to happen. I clenched my fists. Don't feed me that same tired line. It didn't just happen. You made choices. Both of you did. Carl rubbed his temples, as if he could push the shame away. Look, I'm sorry. I screwed up. I know that. I took another step toward him. You betrayed me. You betrayed your family. And for what? For stolen moments and whispered lies? He didn't answer. What could he say? There was no justification, no excuse that could undo what he'd done. For a long moment, we stood there in silence. Finally, I spoke again. Does your wife know? Carl's head snapped up. No. Please, don't tell her. I stared at him, feeling a strange, cold clarity settle over me. Why shouldn't she know? She deserves the truth. Just like I did. He opened his mouth to argue but shut it again. He knew I was right. That night, I returned home to find Caroline waiting in the kitchen. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen from crying. She didn't say anything as I walked in, just watched me with a desperate hope that twisted something deep inside me. I poured myself a glass of bourbon, savoring the burn as it went down. Then I finally broke the silence. "It's done." Her lips trembled. "What do you mean?" "I've spoken to all of them, Dominic, Andrew, Carl. They know it's over." Her hands trembled as they hovered near her face, fingers curling into fists before pressing against her mouth, as if she could hold back the sobs threatening to break free. Her whole body shook, each breath ragged and uneven. "Liam. I don't know how to fix this." I set my glass down, staring at her. "Neither do I." For a long time, we stood there, the distance between us growing with every second of silence. Then she whispered, "I love you." I never stopped. I closed my eyes, letting the words wash over me. Maybe that's true. But love isn't enough, Caroline. Not anymore. Her sobs grew louder, and I turned away, walking toward the stairs. As I reached the top, I glanced back down. She stood there, a broken woman clinging to the remnants of a life we'd both lost. The house was quiet, save for her muffled cries. Our daughters were asleep, blissfully unaware of how fragile their world had become. The next morning, I packed a bag. Caroline stood at the doorway, her eyes pleading. "Where are you going?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "But I need to figure out who I am without all of this." I gestured to the house, the life we'd built. "Without the lies. Are you coming back?" Her voice was barely a whisper. I didn't answer. Instead, I kissed her forehead, a gesture that felt more like a farewell than a promise. "I'll be in touch with the girls," I said softly. "They'll need me." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. As I stepped outside into the crisp morning air, I took a deep breath. For the first time in weeks, the weight on my chest felt lighter. The road stretched out before me, uncertain and full of questions. But one thing was clear. This was the end of what we had. But it wasn't the end of my story.